the seed of greed, when love turned to chains. Greed is a quiet seed. It begins so small that you hardly notice it has been planted. A thought in the heart, a whisper in the ear, a glance at what belongs to another. And if you do not pull it out, it grows into a tree that casts a shadow over everything pure. In Africa, we say, the eyes that refuse to be satisfied will one day put a man in trouble. This is not just a proverb, it is life. Many men and women have destroyed their families not because they were poor, but because they wanted more than life was ready to give them. This story is not about distant strangers. It is about us, our homes, our neighbors, our brothers and sisters who rise too fast, only to fall too hard. It is a warning. It is a mirror. And it is the truth that too many refuse to face. Tonight, I will take you into the heart of a family. A mother who carried the weight of survival on her shoulders. A son who was torn between love and hunger, hope and despair. And a friend who dangled wealth before him like a poisoned fruit. This is the tale of Emeka and Mama Ruth. A story of poverty, temptation, quick riches, and the heavy price of greed. Watch closely because hidden in their story is a lesson that could save your soul. The city was alive, but for Mama Ruth and her son, Emeka, life was nothing but survival. They lived in a cramped one-room apartment tucked behind a noisy Lagos street. The walls were cracked, rainwater leaked through the zinc roof, and the smell of kerosene smoke often filled the air from the neighbors' stoves. Every morning, Mama Ruth rose before the first call of the rooster. With her tired hands, she tied her faded wrapper, adjusted her headscarf, and prepared her basin of vegetables to sell at the roadside market. She had once been a beautiful, vibrant woman, but hardship had carved deep lines into her face. Her eyes carried both determination and sorrow, the look of someone who had fought. Too many battles but refused to surrender. The market was her battlefield. Under the scorching sun and in the pounding rain, she sold peppers, tomatoes, onions, and bitter leaf. Sometimes she came home with a little profit. Many times she returned empty-handed, her goods rotting before her eyes. Yet every day she went back again because hunger does not rest. Emeka was her only son, the light of her life. He was a brilliant young man, a university graduate who had dreamed of wearing a suit and tie, walking into an office with air conditioning and respect. But dreams die quickly. In a world where connections and bribes open doors faster than certificates. For months he had searched for work. He had queued for interviews. He had written applications until his pen ran dry. But every door closed. And so Emeka remained at home, restless, watching his mother break her back for survival. Their meals were often little more than Gary soaked in water, sometimes with sugar, other times with nothing at all. On rare days when Mama Ruth made enough from the market, she would bring home a small piece of meat to flavor their soup. Those days felt like celebrations. But poverty is not just about food. It is about dignity. It is about shame. The landlord had given them countless warnings about unpaid rent. Neighbors whispered when they passed by. Some mocked them. Others pitied them. Emeka often sat outside on a broken wooden chair, his head in his hands, asking himself why life had been so cruel. Despite the hardship, Mama Ruth prayed every morning. Her cracked lips would move in whispered supplications, her hands lifted toward heaven. She prayed for her son's future, for strength to endure, for a miracle to come. Sometimes she smiled at him and said, "Better days are coming." But her eyes betrayed the pain of uncertainty. Every day felt heavier than the last. The city's wealth sparkled in their faces. Big cars, tall houses, people who seemed to have everything. But in their tiny room, the weight of poverty pressed down like a curse. And in that pressure, something dark began to grow in Emeka's heart. A restlessness, a desire. A dangerous thought that whispered, there must be another way. What he did not know was that the seed of greed had just been planted. Life has a way of mocking the poor. While Emeka sat in his mother's tiny room, wrestling with his thoughts, the world outside seemed to shine brighter every day. Cars sped by, music blasted from big speakers, and the city laughed in the face of those who had nothing. Lagos was alive, but for the poor, the city was not a home. It was a reminder of how far behind they were. One hot afternoon, when the sun burned like fire on iron roofs, Emeka left the house to clear his head. His stomach was empty, but his heart was heavier than his hunger. He wandered through the streets, past shops selling clothes he could never afford, past restaurants where the smell of fried meat and jollof rice made his belly twist with longing. He walked aimlessly, his mind spinning with questions. Why me? Why my mother? Why do others rise while we sink deeper? It was on this wandering that fate brought him face to face with temptation. A sleek black car, polished like glass, pulled up beside the road. The kind of car that turned heads, that made people stop and stare. From it stepped a young man, dressed in an expensive suit that clung to his body like it was made only for him. His wrist glittered with a golden watch. His shoes shone brighter than the sun. He walked with the kind of confidence only wealth could buy. Emeka's heart skipped. He knew that face. It was Tunde, his old classmate from university. Back then, they had sat in the same lecture halls, shared the same cheap meals, and even complained together about their broken hostel rooms. Yet now, while Emeka was still trapped in poverty, Tunde had risen like a king. The sight pierced Emeka like a knife. He felt both joy and shame. Joy to see a familiar face. Shame because he had nothing to show for himself. And as Tunde laughed, greeting others, his voice carried the power of someone who was respected and admired. Emeka's chest tightened. He thought of his mother selling vegetables under the sun while his mate walked around like royalty. That night, sleep abandoned him. He tossed and turned on his thin mattress, staring at the ceiling as the sound of rats scratching in the corner filled the room. His mother snored softly beside him, exhausted from the day's struggle. But Emeka's mind was not at rest. He could not erase the image of Tunde stepping out of that black car, shining like a star in a city that respected only wealth. Questions burned him like hot coals. How did Tunde do it? What secret opened the door for him? And why is it that I, who studied just as hard, now sit in shame? Over the next few days, Emeka began to notice what he had ignored before. Wealthy young men filled the city, driving cars they had not worked for, buying drinks worth more than his mother's monthly sales, throwing money in the air at parties like it was dust. He saw them in hotels and nightclubs, in the arms of women who laughed and danced like life was without end. They were young, but they carried riches that old men worked lifetimes to earn. Emeka's heart grew restless. A storm brewed inside him. Poverty had already planted the seed. Now envy began to water it. At home, Mama Ruth continued her prayers, whispering to God for help, wiping sweat from her brow after long days at the market. But her son's eyes had begun to change. They no longer carried just hope. They carried hunger, not just for food, but for wealth, for status, for escape. Slowly, Emeka began to withdraw from his mother's words. When she spoke of patience, he heard delay. When she spoke of prayer, he heard weakness. When she spoke of waiting, he heard wasting. And while he still loved her deeply, something else was tugging at his soul, a voice louder than her prayers, sweeter than her comfort. It was the voice of temptation. The city had opened its arms to him, whispering promises of shortcuts, flashing the illusion of easy riches. The more he resisted, the stronger the whisper became. It followed him through the streets, into his dreams, even in the quiet moments when he sat with his mother. It was a constant pressing thought. Others have done it. Why not you? Poverty is a prison. Break free. And so, Emeka stood at the edge of a dangerous path. A path where many had walked before, believing they could take just a little and stop, believing they were stronger than the chains waiting to bind them. He did not yet know that greed never gives without taking more. He did not yet understand that shortcuts often lead to dead ends. But the door had already opened in his heart. The seed of greed, once planted, had found its water. It was only a matter of time before it grew into a tree, whose branches would cover everything he once loved. Night in the city has two faces. For the poor, it is a time to rest weary bones, to curl under thin blankets, to hope for strength to face another day. But for the restless, the ambitious, and the greedy, the night is a stage where dangerous plays unfold. For Emeka, it began with a call he could not ignore. A friend's invitation, a whisper about a gathering, a promise that if he only showed up, his life would never be the same again. He hesitated at first, but temptation is patient. It never shouts, it waits. And when the pressure of poverty became unbearable, when hunger gnawed deeper than hope, Emeka answered the call. It was a moonless night. The air was heavy, the kind of night when even dogs do not bark. Emeka was led through back streets he had never walked before, past abandoned buildings where shadows lingered. The deeper he went, the colder the air became. His chest tightened, his steps slowed, but the thought of wealth pulled him forward. At last he reached a compound hidden from ordinary eyes. Its high walls blocked the outside world. The gates creaked open, not with the sound of welcome, but of warning. Inside, the atmosphere was different, too still, too deliberate. The ground was marked with strange symbols, drawn in white chalk that glowed faintly in the lantern light. At the center of the yard, a large wooden table stood draped in red cloth. Around it, men in dark robes moved silently, their faces half covered. They did not speak, yet their presence was heavy, pressing on Emeka's chest like a weight. A thick smell of burning herbs filled the air. It was neither pleasant nor foul, but unsettling. The kind of scent that told the soul it did not belong here. Candles burned in circles, their flames dancing as though invisible hands stirred them. Emeka's heart pounded. Every step he took echoed in his ears. He wanted to turn back, to run, to forget he had ever come. But greed is stronger than fear once it takes root. His mind replayed the memory of his mother's weary face, the hunger in their small room, the shame of poverty. And so he pressed on. A figure stepped forward, tall, commanding, faceless under the hood. He raised his hand, and the others fell silent. The air grew colder still. Without words, they led Emeka to the center. There, a shallow bowl was placed before him, filled with liquid darker than night. He was handed a small blade, its edge catching the candlelight. The meaning was clear: sacrifice, commitment. An oath sealed not by words, but by blood. Emeka's hand trembled. His knees weakened. For a moment, the weight of his decision nearly crushed him. But the thought of wealth, of cars, of respect, pushed him onward. He pressed the blade to his skin, wincing as it broke. A drop of blood fell into the bowl. The circle of men hummed in unison, a low, haunting sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The ritual had begun. What followed was a blur of fear and wonder. Chants filled the air, rising and falling like waves. The ground seemed to vibrate beneath his feet. The flames of the candles bent unnaturally, swaying toward him as though acknowledging his sacrifice. The hooded men lifted their hands, their voices merging into a rhythm that made his heart race faster than it ever had. Then silence. Complete silence. The tall figure placed a hand on his shoulder. Though no words were spoken, the message burned into Emeka's mind. From this night, your life is no longer yours. Your wealth is secured, but your freedom is gone. You will eat the fruit of riches, but you will not taste love. You will enjoy the world, but you will not share it with your blood. A chill ran through him. He wanted to question, to resist, but his mouth refused to open. He was bound, not by rope, not by chains, but by an oath stronger than steel. The ritual ended as quietly as it began. The men dispersed into the shadows, leaving him standing alone, trembling, the cut on his hand still stinging. The red cloth was folded, the candles blown out, the symbols on the ground fading as if they had never been there. When he finally stepped out of the compound, the city was the same, yet everything had changed. The night was still, the stars shone faintly, but Emeka knew he was no longer the same man who entered. Greed had given him the key, but it was a key that opened one door and locked every other behind him. He had gained wealth, but he had lost something far greater. And as he walked back to his mother's house, unaware of the storm that now followed him, the seed of greed had grown into a tree whose roots would soon strangle his soul. Morning came with no sign of what had happened the night before. The sun rose, the streets buzzed with life. The city moved as though nothing had changed. But inside Emeka, a new world had begun. The blood oath had unlocked doors he could not see with his eyes. Yet he could feel its grip tightening around his soul. It started subtly. The very next day, strangers began to recognize him. A man he had never met before offered him a job, high-paying, effortless, more like a title than real work. The week after, another opportunity appeared. This time, an investment that multiplied faster than logic could explain. Within a month, Emeka had what his mother had prayed for over the years: money. Not just enough to feed them, but more than he could count. The change was immediate. He no longer walked on dusty streets with patched shoes. Instead, sleek cars carried him from one corner of the city to another. Clothes once beyond his reach now hung in his wardrobe in endless rows. Silks, suits, shoes polished to perfection. Restaurants that once mocked him with their aroma now welcomed him with open arms, waiters bowing as though he were a king. The neighbors who had mocked him began to whisper a different tune. Some said he was blessed. Others said fortune had smiled on him. They did not ask too many questions. They were too busy admiring the transformation. Women who once ignored him now smiled at him, their eyes glittering with interest. His presence demanded respect. Even the landlord who once threatened eviction now greeted him with a trembling bow. But wealth is never silent. It sings loudly, and its song attracts not only admiration but also chains. Parties began to fill his nights, lavish gatherings, where bottles popped like water and laughter drowned out the sound of conscience. Money flowed like a river, but peace fled like a bird. At home, Mama Ruth watched with both relief and sorrow. Her son no longer wore the clothes of poverty, but she felt a distance growing. He provided money, yes, but the warmth of love was gone. He came home less and less, and when he did, his eyes seemed different, harder, colder. Weighed down by shadows she could not understand, the nights became Emeka's torment. Alone in his mansion, surrounded by luxury, he could not sleep. Dreams twisted into nightmares. He saw faceless men in robes, candles burning endlessly, blood dripping into bowls. He woke up drenched in sweat, his heart racing, his body trembling. No matter how much he tried to forget, the memory of the oath returned, haunting him. And then came the loneliness. The oath's condition, once a whisper, began to show its teeth. Whenever he thought of starting a family, of marrying, of giving his mother the comfort she deserved, a force stronger than him pulled it away. Women came and went, but none stayed. His mother remained alive, but he felt an invisible wall between them. He could buy her a house, fill her kitchen with food, but he could not give her the one thing she craved most, his presence, his love. Slowly, his health began to falter. He grew pale, his eyes sunken, his steps heavy. Doctors could not explain it. They called it stress, exhaustion, overwork. But Emeka knew better. It was the chains of greed tightening around him, draining his soul. The same seed that had promised freedom was now bearing fruit, and that fruit was bitter. One night at a party where laughter filled the air and music shook the ground, Emeka collapsed. In the middle of flashing lights and dancing bodies, his body gave way. Friends who once praised him scattered like frightened birds, leaving him on the cold floor, gasping for breath. In that moment, everything became clear. The wealth, the respect, the glitter, it was nothing but dust. His body was failing, his soul was bound, and the oath had come to collect its debt. The rise was fast, too fast for his mind to question. But the fall was even faster, a spiral from glory to shame, from applause to silence. And so Emeka lay in his bed, weak and trembling, knowing the storm had only begun. The wealth had filled his hands, but it had emptied his heart. The world had given him gold, but it had taken his soul. The rise had been sweet, the fall was bitter, and the end was near. The grave had been covered. The mourners had gone home. Silence returned to the small corner of the cemetery where Emeka now lay. Dust had claimed what wealth could not protect, and in that quiet moment, a truth echoed louder than any drum beat. Riches without peace are chains, not blessings. Mama Ruth returned to her little home, the same one she had struggled in for years. Though her son had risen to mansions and cars, she was now back in the room with its cracked walls and leaking roof. But this time, it was not poverty that weighed on her shoulders. It was grief. The kind of grief that pierces deeper than hunger, that no money can heal. The city moved on quickly. Lagos streets were still full of noise, music, and laughter. The cars still sped past, and the rich still threw their parties. But those who knew Emeka whispered in corners. They shook their heads and said, "He flew too close to the fire. He wanted the crown, but he wore chains instead." His story became a warning, a shadow hanging over every young man who dreamed of wealth without patience. And so, his life left behind not riches, but a lesson. In Africa, the elders say, "The goat that follows the thief into the market will also end up in the pot." Greed is never satisfied. It does not give. It only takes, slowly at first, then all at once. Those who chase it will one day pay with what they love most. The Bible also warns us clearly. 1 Timothy 6:9. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and Destruction. Emeka's story was written long before he was born, in the choices of many who took the wrong path. He only walked where others had fallen. And now his name joins the countless voices that remind us, wealth gained in darkness never lasts. So, my brother, my sister, as you hear this story tonight, ask yourself, what are you chasing? Are you walking the slow path of patience? Or are you stretching your hand toward poisoned fruit? Have you allowed greed to plant a seed in your heart? Remember, poverty is heavy, yes. Hunger is cruel, but nothing destroys faster than riches without peace. Nothing kills quicker than wealth that comes with chains. Take this story as a warning, not just a tale. Guard your heart, guard your choices, and never trade your soul for gold. For what shall it profit a man to gain the whole world and yet lose his soul? And to you, our dear viewers, if this story touched your heart, do not keep it to yourself. Share it, let it remind others of the truth, and subscribe to African Tales Untold Truth. Because every week, we bring you stories that open eyes, stories that warn, stories that heal. For in these tales lie the wisdom of our ancestors, the light of the scriptures, and the truth our generation desperately needs.